Welcome back for another Sheriff of Sodium video. Death of a program, the ACGME versus private equity. Today I'm going to tell you a story about a residency program, but the story I want to tell is not really just a story about that one program. It's a story about power and greed, and I want to share it because I think it highlights a number of things that are wrong about residency training and the American healthcare system and maybe even America at large. The residency program is the Crozer Chester Medical Center General Surgery Residency Program. This here's their webpage. I first heard about it in January of this year when a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer reached out to try to understand a story that he was working on. He'd learned that the General Surgery Program had just received notice from the ACGME that they were stripping the program of its accreditation. And he went on to explain that the hospital had received this notice on January 8th. And they told the hospital that they would have to shut down the residency program completely by January 12th, just 4 days later. And he asked me if this is the way that these kind of things typically go. And I told him it most assuredly wasn't. I mean, it's not unusual for residency programs to lose their accreditation, but the typical way that goes is that the program shuts down at the end of an academic year. Actually, most programs that lose their accreditation, they actually give it up voluntarily, usually because the hospital is shutting down or there's been some loss of faculty, and they just sort of wind down the residency program too. But the ACGME didn't just withdraw Crozer's accreditation. They withdrew it under special circumstances. And that's not a common action. In fact, I looked back through the past 5 years of ACGME decisions, and Crozer was the first surgery program to lose their accreditation under special circumstances since the 2019-2020 academic year. So the reporter asked me, well, what does that mean, special circumstances? What happened to cause the ACGME to take this action? And I said, I don't know, but it wasn't anything good. Here's the relevant portion of the ACGME Policies and Procedures Manual, section 19.100. And it says, regardless of a program's accreditation status, the review committee may withdraw the accreditation of the program based on clear evidence of a lack of substantial compliance with accreditation requirements, such as a catastrophic loss of resources, including faculty members, facilities, or funding, or egregious noncompliance with accreditation requirements. So 2 things to note about this. First, the ACGME only takes this kind of action based on clear evidence. If they merely find evidence that's concerning or worrisome or strongly suggestive that the program isn't deserving of accreditation, then they use the regular process. Only when they believe that the evidence is absolutely damning does the ACGME proceed down this path. Second, there are a lot of ACGME program requirements. There are 48 pages, in fact, of common program requirements. And the requirements for general surgery programs, those run an additional 59 pages. But to get your accreditation yanked under special circumstances, you can't just come up short with the resources you're providing or miss a couple of accreditation standards here or there. The only way that your program finds itself in this situation is when there's a, quote, catastrophic loss of resources, or there's a, quote, egregious noncompliance with accreditation requirements. There's nothing good that causes the ACGME to shut you down and then give you 4 days to clear out the whole shop. So what could it be? Well, the reporter gave me some idea. Because see, he didn't just stumble onto this story. He'd been following a number of stories related to the hospital over time. Crozer Chester Medical Center had fallen onto desperate financial times. Here's a sampling of some of their headlines over the past year. From March of 2023, unpaid bills, prospect Crozer Health struggling to pay vendors for vital hospital services. This article describes, among other things, how the pharmacy ran out of equipment to package drugs because those items were on a credit hold with a supplier. So they had to put inpatient medicines in little Ziploc baggies and they sent them out to the floors and ICUs that way. Or how patients couldn't get PICC lines because the hospital didn't pay their bills for that. Or how they used to have a uniformed police officer stationed at the hospital for patient and staff security, but they had to give that up because they couldn't pay for it. From May of 2023, Crozer Health lays off 215 people as part of operational restructuring plan. This article goes on to explain that's approximately 4% of the company's workforce. A few months before, they'd actually suspended all 401k matching, and a couple of their new ambulances got repossessed by the dealers. From June, more trouble with the ambulance fleet. Crozer Health prospect unable to pay for ambulance repairs. Now, this article is talking about their remaining ambulances, the ones that didn't get repossessed, which the article says were produced in the 1990s and have over 200,000 miles on them. Anyhow, the mechanic who had been repairing them and keeping them running was owed $120,000 and had refused to do any more work for the hospital until he was paid. And no other vendor locally was willing to work with the hospital because of their payment history. And then there's this one. Piles of biohazard bags, delayed medications. Inspection report finds ongoing problems at Crozer Chester. The article begins, biohazard waste bags piled on the loading dock, urgent medications delayed for hours, and a nurse who was allowed to work without a Pennsylvania license. These are among the safety violations flagged so far this year at Crozer Chester Medical Center. Now, this article came out in November, and the reporter told me that it was back then, in November, that a resident had made an anonymous complaint to the ACGME. He told me that he'd heard that the surgical residents didn't have enough cases, that sometimes they didn't even have sterilized surgical trays or other necessary supplies to operate, so they had to cancel the case or send the patient elsewhere. And then there was an allegation that despite all this, the residents were being encouraged to submit fraudulent ACGME case logs by duplicating every single case that they actually did do. They'd enter it once with the patient's medical record number and then once with the financial identification number. So with all this, I told him, yeah, sounds like the ACGME is doing the right thing. I mean, it's their responsibility to ensure that residency training programs are actually training residents to be competent, safe physicians and surgeons. Ultimately, it's the ACGME's job not only to protect the residents, but to protect the general public. And it sounded to me like Crozer Medical Center was an absolute mess and that swift and decisive action was probably very necessary. And actually, in our conversation, I actually speculated that the hospital might not even fight the loss of accreditation because in a case like this, I mean, what's the point? What would you even say? Well, I was wrong about that. Remember, the hospital was told on January 8th that the program had to be shut down by January 12th. So on January 11th, they officially lodged an appeal with the ACGME. But this created a problem for the residents because that appeal wasn't going to get heard till the end of January, and it wouldn't be decided until June. And the ACGME said that if the appeal failed, then the official date of a loss of accreditation would be logged as being in January. And on the one hand, that makes perfect sense. I mean, if it's truly the case that the program was not appropriately training their residents, then the training that they're doing, it shouldn't count. You shouldn't reward a bad program by allowing them to keep doing bad training just because they refuse to be honest and own up to the fact they were doing a bad job. We've found clear evidence that you've suffered a catastrophic loss of resources or an egregious noncompliance with accreditation requirements. What do you have to say about that? Well, that's just like your opinion, man. Well, all right, I guess you got us there. Carry on. We'll see you in 6 months. Keep doing what you're doing. Does that make sense to you? But on the other hand, this situation with the appeal, it ended up putting residents in an even worse predicament. And here's why. Here's another section from the ACGME Policies and Procedures Manual, Section 19.101. It describes the responsibilities of the program once accreditation has been withdrawn under special circumstances. And one of those responsibilities, responsibility C, is that the sponsoring institution or program becomes responsible for the placement of the enrolled program residents into other ACGME accredited programs. But notice, this responsibility only occurs upon withdrawal of accreditation under special circumstances. So if you appeal, well, that withdrawal, it hasn't yet occurred. So until then, the program has no obligation to help residents find new positions. Now you could say, why does that matter? Why don't the residents just leave? I mean, why do they have to rely on the assistance of the program, especially when the program is sort of already proven to be dysfunctional? But if you ask that question, I guess I got to ask you, I mean, if it were so easy for the residents to leave, why did they stay this long? Why did they reach out to the ACGME for help? Or why didn't they just up and leave before? Because see, if a resident wants to leave a program, there's at least 3 problems that they face. The first program is that a resident can't just transfer like, a college student can. They can go to another institution, but only if that institution has an open position. Remember, programs get accredited to provide a certain number of positions based on their ability to provide a certain educational experience. A program can't just take in any number of residents that they want. So problem number 1 is that there's a limited number of positions available. Second, it's very hard to change programs without the support of your program director and faculty. Let me tell you, no program wants to take on someone else's problem resident. Any program director is going to want to hear from the old program director. Now, if it were just these 2 problems, though, I think those 2 things would be overcomeable. I mean, there may not be a whole lot of general surgery residency positions that are open, but you don't need a whole lot. I mean, a given person needs just 1 to transfer. The whole program, in this case, they only need 15. And, I don't know anything about the Crozer program director, but most program directors, not all, but most, they're fundamentally decent people who do the job because they care about residents and they want to see residents succeed. And even if you have a program who doesn't feel that way, many programs, I think, would still be willing to give the resident the benefit of the doubt when their whole program has gone under or is going under, because they can see from the outside that that's not the resident's fault. So it might be that the first 2 problems you could get past. But there's one more problem. There's a financial barrier. See, most residency positions are subsidized by the federal government through CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, through something called Direct Graduate Medical Education, or DGME payments. These DGME payments are intended to offset the direct costs of training a resident, like paying for their salary and benefits. Now, this is not the only way the government subsidizes residency. There's actually an indirect medical educament, or IME payment as well. And if you've watched my video on what resident physicians are worth, you know that in many cases, neither of these subsidies is necessary to make having a resident be a financial winner for the hospital. But they sure do sweeten the deal. In 2020, the average DGME payment that a hospital received was around $51,000. But what's important to note is that these DGME payments, they're an asset of the hospital. They don't automatically transfer if a resident transfers. Even if a program or hospital closes down, the right to receive these payments, it remains a hospital asset. We saw one example of this play out in detail in 2019 when the Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia went bankrupt and they closed down all their residency programs. We saw headlines like this one, with copy that reads, "Hahnemann University Hospital's more than 550 residency slots have been sold at auction for $55 million to a consortium of 6 local health systems." But of course, what was being auctioned off was not the residents themselves. It was the right to receive federal funding for training residents. And in this case, that right was sold for around $100,000 per position in this bankruptcy fire sale. My point is that although DGME payments usually follow residents, those payments are hospital property. And in this case, Crozer made it clear that they were going to retain the rights to their property until their appeal was decided. So any hospital who took in a fleeing resident, they could, but they're going to have to pay for that resident's training themselves. In other words, although the residents were free to leave, the hospital wasn't necessarily going to make it easy for them. But at the same time, what choice did the residents have? If they just stuck around till the appeal got decided, they might find out that nothing that they did from January to June would count toward completing their residency. I want you to think about that for a minute. It's hard enough to be a resident. It's even harder to be a general surgery resident. And it's harder still to be a general surgery resident in a program that's suffered a catastrophic loss of resources or is in egregious noncompliance with ACGME standards. But to do all that for free, for an additional 5 months, I think that puts you in a different circle of hell altogether. And what would you do? Well, I'll tell you what the residents did. 9 out of the 15 of them announced that they wanted to transfer. So you know what happened next? The hospital's parent company, Prospect Medical Holdings, sued the ACGME. In the suit, Prospect pointed out that surgical residents are a critical part of the medical team that cares for Crozer's patients, and that Crozer's patients are disproportionately poor and underserved. And all that's true as far as it goes. And they went on to point out that the loss of the surgical residents could hurt these vulnerable and underserved patients because then those people would have to seek care elsewhere. And this is possibly true also, although it's a little more up for debate about whether patients are best served getting cared for by residents in a setting in which there's been a catastrophic loss of resources or egregious noncompliance with ACGME training standards, or whether those patients might be better off receiving care elsewhere, even with the geographic or logistical hurdles that would entail. And the lawsuit specifically highlights the predicament that the residents were in, where by choosing to remain in the program, they might find themselves in June unable to receive credit for the 5 months that they toiled away while the program wasn't in compliance with ACGME standards. And this is also true enough, although the lawsuit's careful to only point out the ways in which the ACGME's policies were forcing residents toward transferring, while carefully sidestepping the issue of anything the program might have done to make the enforcement of the ACGME's policies necessary. Actually, as an aside, there's one very interesting omission from the lawsuit that Prospect filed. The lawsuit makes reference to a 12-page, single-space letter from the ACGME detailing 31 different program violations. But that letter itself doesn't appear in the documents that are available to the public. Anyhow, Prospect claimed that the loss of the surgical residents would hurt patients and that irreparable harm would be done to the public if the ACGME's action was allowed to proceed. So they asked the court for an order that would immediately reinstate the program's accreditation back to what it was on January 1st, back when they had continuing accreditation. And they also asked for an order that would enjoin the ACGME from retroactively rescinding accreditation in the future. What that means is, if their appeal failed, the ACGME would not be allowed to go back and say that training time from January to June didn't count. But this lawsuit, it had some other interesting things in it too. For one, the plaintiffs described having a conference call with the ACGME on January 12th. But during that call, they were joined by representatives from the Pennsylvania Governor's Office and the Office of the Attorney General. And the lawsuit actually included a sternly worded letter from Mr. James A. Donahue III, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's first Deputy Attorney General, who noted, "Without the surgical residents, Crozer's ability to service the residents of Delaware County will be severely impaired. Crozer is a trauma and burn center. It sits just outside the city of Chester, which has a poverty rate greater than 30%. The patient mix at the hospital is predominantly Medicare and Medicaid patients. In other environments, it might be easy to replace surgical residents with surgeons from the community. However, the demographics of the greater Chester area are such that replacements are not available. Under these circumstances, a retroactive withdrawal will only have the effect of causing the transfer of residents out of the program, potentially endangering the continued operation of a safety net hospital. While we respect the ACGME's processes, we request that the withdrawal of accreditation not be applied retroactively should Crozer lose its appeal." The Deputy AG also went on to note the Attorney General's office's legal authority to protect the citizens of Pennsylvania and its willingness to exercise that authority over all nonprofit organizations involved in this matter. So what happened next? The ACGME blinked. Facing the prospect of litigation with the fifth largest state in the US of A, the ACGME decided that they'd give in, or at least I'm pretty sure that's what happened. Within a few days of filing it, Prospect withdrew their lawsuit, which I can only imagine they would have done if the ACGME had acceded to their demands to let training time count from January to June so the residents wouldn't transfer. And if you're out there saying, "But Sheriff, why did the governor and attorney general care so much about this issue?" Well, partner, sounds like you're about ready to hear the most interesting part of this sordid tale, so mount up. Let me start with a little history. Crozer Health was an organization that formed in 1990 when the Chester Medical Center merged with another local hospital, Delaware County Memorial. 20 years later, they'd added 2 more local hospitals and they were employing over 4,000 employees, but Like many hospital systems, they were struggling financially. And so in 2016, they were taken over by an organization called Prospect Medical Holdings, which also operates hospitals in California, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. As part of the deal, the nonprofit Crozer system became for-profit because Prospect Medical Holdings was owned at the time by a Los Angeles-based private equity firm called Leonard Green and Partners. And this has become a familiar story in American healthcare. As big health systems get bigger and bigger, smaller players, whether we're talking about physician groups or smaller hospitals or clinics or outpatient surgical centers or whatever else, these smaller players find it harder to negotiate reimbursement and keep their books looking as good as they did in the past. And sometimes private equity gets portrayed as the savior. You know, those private equity guys, they're going to come in here and figure out how to make your business do business better. They're going to get up in there and they're going to trim all the fat, and they're going to maximize efficiency, and they're going to get that thing humming along. And then after they've maximized the value, they'll sell it to somebody else. Kind of like flipping houses. You know, you find something that's got good bones, you put in a little sweat equity to help it reach its potential, and then you sell it quickly for a nice profit. And maybe that's how it goes sometimes. But sometimes people are working as hard and as efficiently as they can be. And there's just really not much more efficiency you can maximize, especially in a short period of time, and especially when an asset has already been flipped to the second or the third or the fourth private equity buyer. And for the record, I should point out, the typical buyer of a medical business that's owned by a private equity firm is another private equity firm. But those realities haven't decreased the demand for private equity to buy new medical businesses. And that's because, in most cases, the private equity firm doesn't even have to make the practice or the hospital more efficient to make more money. And if you want to know what I mean, let me introduce you to the Leonard Green and Partners playbook. What I'm sharing with you now comes from a report called How Private Equity Raided Safety Net Hospitals and Left Communities Holding the Bag. I'll link to it in the notes below. It's written by a researcher named Eileen O'Grady, and she uses Prospect Health as a case study to show some of the techniques that private equity firms can use to extract cash from the businesses they buy. Here's one. It's called dividend recapitalization. Basically, what the private equity firm does is it loads up its new asset with debt, then it uses the money that they borrowed to pay themselves. This is exactly what Prospect Health did. They took on $1.1 billion of debt leveraged onto the hospitals that they owned. And then, in 2018, they paid a dividend of $457 million in cash out to the Leonard Green-led investment group. Now that same year that the private equity stakeholders got their payout, Prospect Medical Holdings reported a $244 million net loss. Here's another cool trick. It's called a sale-leaseback transaction. And basically it involves having the hospitals sell their real estate to a real estate investment trust. Then the hospital leases back its land and buildings from that new company. So the day-to-day operation of the hospital is unchanged. They just got to give up their most valuable asset, and now they have to pay rent to someone else to keep using it. It didn't take too long for stuff like this to get Prospect Health into some real financial trouble with running their hospitals. By 2020, Prospect Health's total liabilities exceeded their total assets by over $1 billion. And at that time, Leonard Green and Partners announced that they would sell their stake in the business for just $12 million. That's right. You could own majority stake in a chain of 17 safety net hospitals for the low price of just $12 million. And in June of 2021, LGP successfully sold their shares in Prospect to the minority stakeholders, and they moved on to greener pastures. But during the time that they owned Prospect, they extracted a total of $658,441,000 from the business, leaving all the debt and all the problems for the hospitals themselves to deal with. By 2022, the costs of doing business with Bartholomew Banks, I mean Leonard Green and Partners, had caught up with Prospect Crozer. Things were falling apart. They couldn't keep one of their hospitals staffed, and it ended up getting shut down by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. But when they closed that hospital, it actually breached their original 2016 purchase agreement. Because part of that deal, when Crozer went from being a nonprofit to a for-profit organization, was that Prospect Health would keep all the Crozer hospitals operational for 10 years at least. So Prospect got sued by a local nonprofit organization, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania joined the lawsuit. And then, in October of last year, just a month before someone made an anonymous complaint to the ACGME about the conditions in the surgical residency program, the parties struck a deal. The Attorney General agreed to drop the lawsuit if Prospect Health sold Crozer and convert it back to a nonprofit health system within the next 270 days. So this is the background of the mess that the Crozer residents found themselves entangled in. And this is why Prospect Health fought so hard to fight the ACGME withdrawal and to keep the residents in place. The residents are an asset. Several times, Prospect's lawsuit mentions the importance of the Chester Medical Center Level 2 Trauma Center. But a Level 2 Trauma Center, that requires 24 hours a day of call coverage. It's expensive to do that if you only have attending physicians, and it's damn near impossible to do it when your hospital's so cash-strapped that they can't pay their own vendors. You need those residents. I mean, that is, unless you want to sell the hospital in the next 270 days without a functioning trauma center. The lawsuit actually included, as an evidentiary exhibit, an email from an attending surgeon expressing that his group was very concerned about the status of the residency program, and needless to say, without the residents, that group was going to be very challenged to cover the trauma ED. Hint, hint. And then there's those DGME payments. I mean, like I said, those are about $51,000 a year per resident. And so with 15 residents, that's a $765,000 asset. And before you say, that's not that much money. I mean, that's like one private equity guy's Christmas bonus. But let's not forget that Leonard Green and Partners, they were willing to sell their entire stake in Prospect for $12 million. And that's 17 hospitals. So just this one asset would be 6% of the total value in the whole chain. Hell yeah, that's worth fighting for. Time to lawyer up. Before I close, I feel like I need to break things down for you, winners and losers style. The first loser should be obvious, the residents. I mean, they were in a real mess here. I can't believe that any of them knew when they matched to this hospital that the place they were going was in the process of being bled dry by private equity raiders. This whole thing wasn't their fault. And they reached out to the ACGME because they knew the training that they were getting was substandard, and they wanted to become competent and skillful and safe surgeons. But they were pawns in a much bigger game than they even knew about. The only silver lining is that I think in the end, most of these residents are going to be okay. Several of them have already transferred on, and they've gone to highly reputable programs. And those that remain, I mean, I'm not going to lie, it's going to suck providing wall-to-wall coverage for the trauma center and helping Prospect maintain value as they proceed towards sale in the dying days of their ACGME appeal. But in the end, I think even those residents are going to find good programs too. Our next loser, the program. I think this program is done. I mean, I called the video Death of a Program for a reason. You can go on an appeal if you want, but I just don't think the ACGME is that far off. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe the Prospect leadership, they really think their residents were doing just fine. I mean, maybe they believe that this whole ACGME thing with the 12 single-space pages and 31 infractions, it's all just trumped up. And if they file their appeal, they're going to beat the case. Or maybe, more likely, as I suggested before, all this stuff is just a way of avoiding the withdrawn accreditation designation and the responsibilities to help residents transfer and hand over their funding when, if they can only delay that for just a few months, they could include the residents as an asset in their upcoming sale. But ultimately, regardless of what happens with the June appeal, I think this program's going away. Next up, another loser, the hospital. Unlike the residents, I'm not so sure this hospital's going to land on its feet. They were struggling financially even before they got in bed with private equity. And by God, the last thing they needed was to fork over a few $100 million to Leonard Green and cough up all their useful assets to real estate trusts. Whoever does buy Crozer, they're going to have a major rebuilding effort on their hands, and they're not going to have a whole lot of natural resources to do it with. Losing the surgery residency, it's going to hurt. But honestly, it's just one problem among many. Their new leadership can just add that to their list of big and not easily solved problems that they're going to have to face. Now, some of you may wonder why I've taken so much time today talking about a community hospital that probably you've never even heard of. But there's a reason for that. I think that when we talk about or we debate or we make policies for graduate medical education, we probably spend 80% of our time and energy thinking about what happens at maybe 20% of hospitals. And those 20%, those are the big name programs at famous institutions. But even though that's what drives the narrative, those hospitals are still a relatively small subset of all residency training programs overall. There's a lot of Crozers out there that are churning out doctors, maybe not so much the doctors who are going to be hobnobbing at big annual meetings or becoming NIH-funded investigators, but the kind of doctors who are actually going to see you or your loved ones in clinic or on the wards if you're sick. So what happens at these hospitals and these programs, it's actually incredibly important because there's more doctors trained at community programs and the off-brand University of such and such than there are at the Cleveland Clinic or Yale New Haven Medical Center, even though thinking about what happens at those programs occupies a whole lot more of our collective consciousness. Moving on, our next loser, the ACGME. To be fair, I think the ACGME did everything right. They got a complaint. They investigated that complaint quickly, and they acted decisively based on what they found. They did what they're supposed to do. But at the same time, in the world of medical education, the ACGME is one of the big dogs. When they speak, everyone listens. If you're a resident or a program director or a hospital administrator, the ACGME's words are gospel. But in this situation, the ACGME came face to face with an even bigger dog. And when they did, they left whimpering and with their tail between their legs. The ACGME's whole reason for being is to insist that whatever graduate medical education occurs, it occurs with the requisite quality. And when they became aware of a situation where they felt they had clear evidence that a program was not offering that, there really wasn't anything they could do about it. They tried, and there was nothing they could do about it. At least not until the money men's deals were done. And don't mistake what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that the ACGME should have fought a losing battle, wasting time and money to push this. I think they correctly sized up the situation that they were in, and they did what they could do. I'm just saying they don't come out looking good in all this. Last, a winner. The only winner in this whole sordid affair. And that's Leonard Green and Partners. They found a floundering but functional hospital system, and they used their business expertise to extract all the wealth and then leave the debt-laden husk of a health system and all of its problems for someone else to figure out. Some of you know I grew up in the far southwestern corner of Virginia, out where Virginia and Kentucky and West Virginia meet. It's coal mining country out there, and this Leonard Green experience, it reminds me of strip mining. When a company gets the mining rights to someone's land and they come in and they rip all the coal out of the land and they leave the barren mountain behind. The erosion, the runoff, the destruction of an entire freaking ecosystem, that becomes someone else's problem. The mining company takes everything of value and then they're on to the next mountain. And although Leonard Green and Partners, they're the main villain in this story, the techniques and tactics that they use, they're hardly unique. Actually, I think many of them are common among many of the private equity companies that are focused on healthcare. And I should be clear that nothing Leonard Green did was illegal. But honestly, I think some of it should be. I think there ought to be some kind of legislative safeguard or at least some kind of vigorous regulatory oversight to police these kind of exploitative and extractive business practices. And I hope that some of you who have more legal or public policy intelligence than I do will devote some of your brain power to figuring out how to protect vulnerable patients and safety net hospitals and residents from the excesses of private equity. And folks, that's all I've got. Thanks for listening.